On the misty banks of Potomac River rises a mansion draped in mystery. Mount Vernon, the estate of George Washington, is not just a house of brick and wood, but a silent witness to the birth of a nation. Within these walls, a farmer became a general became a president, and a man's contradictions became America's story. Yet behind the grandeur lies a darker truth, a paradox of freedom and bondage that still haunts its halls. What secrets linger in its rooms? What truths echo in its gardens? Tonight, we step into the world of Mount Vernon, where history, legend, and mystery are forever entwined. Welcome to the History Vault. Stay with us as we uncover history. Mount Vernon stands quietly on the edge of the Potomac River, yet its silence carries centuries of stories. It was more than a house built of wood and stone. It was the private world of George Washington, a man remembered as both the first president of the United States and a figure who carried on his shoulders the hopes of a young nation. When one imagines Mount Vernon, it is easy to think only of its grand portico and its sweeping views over the waters. But behind those walls lay the hidden life of a leader who tried to balance two sides of himself. The farmer who longed for the rhythm of the land, and the president who could never escape the call of duty. The estate became his retreat, yet it was also a place where he thought, planned, and tested ideas that would later shape America. The mansion itself reflected this dual identity. Its Georgian design carried dignity without excessive luxury, just as Washington wished to appear as a man of the people while still commanding respect. Each corner of the house tells us something about him. The study, with its simple desk and shelves of worn books, shows the private thinker who pored over maps and letters, seeking clarity in the midst of political storms. The dining room, painted in bold green, shows his willingness to embrace refinement and taste, to welcome guests from across the Atlantic, and display an America that was cultured as well as determined. Even the gardens and pathways, carefully laid out, were not simply for beauty but for order and discipline, reflecting the same values he brought to the battlefield and later to the presidency. When he walked the grounds at sunrise, watching the mist rise from the river, he was not only a landowner checking his fields, but also a man quietly considering the course of history that he had set into motion. What makes Mount Vernon powerful is the way it connects us to both the public figure and the private man. For the public, Washington was a hero of independence, the general who turned ragged troops into a fighting force, the statesman who resisted power when offered a crown. But within his home, he was simply a man surrounded by family, letters from distant friends, and the challenges of running a plantation. This contrast makes the estate something like a mirror, reflecting both sides without letting either fade away. Visitors in his time often noted this balance. They saw the general who commanded respect in every gesture, but they also saw the farmer who took pride in his wheat fields, his orchards, and his experiments with crop rotation. He called Mount Vernon his vine and fig tree, a phrase from Scripture that symbolized peace and contentment. And yet, peace was always interrupted by duty. Even after retiring from the presidency, Washington was often pulled back into the affairs of the young republic. Letters arrived daily, carrying requests for advice or demands for leadership, and many were answered from the same desk where he once dreamed of nothing more than quiet farming. In this sense, Mount Vernon became a silent witness to the tug-of-war between his personal longing for rest and his public role as a national figure. The mansion's walls heard conversations about treaties, debts, and alliances, just as they also heard the laughter of grandchildren running through its halls. They absorbed the weight of history, while also sheltering the ordinary life of a man who valued simplicity. The estate's location on the river was no accident either. From the broad portico, Washington could watch ships carrying tobacco, flour, and goods, a reminder that America's strength rested not only on politics, but also on the steady work of trade and farming. The river became a symbol of movement, of ideas and commerce flowing past, and perhaps of the passage of time itself. Standing there, he could look outward to the horizon and inward to his own thoughts, finding in the same view both rest and challenge. For today's visitors, this view still speaks of continuity. It tells us that Washington was not a figure carved from marble, but a man with hopes, fears, and contradictions, all tied to this land he loved. Mount Vernon, therefore, is not simply a museum piece, but a living story. Every brick, every room, every tree planted on its grounds carries part of that narrative. To walk its paths is to sense the presence of a leader who shaped a nation, yet always wished to return to his farm. It reminds us that the story of America did not only unfold in battlefields or government halls, but also in the quiet corners of a riverside estate, where a man sought harmony between duty and desire. Mount Vernon's lasting power is found in this truth. It was both a home and a stage, both a retreat and a place of planning, both the dream of a farmer and the workshop of a president. It held within the soul of George Washington, a soul that could not separate the plow from the sword or the heart from the halls of power. And in that union we still glimpse the very heart of revolution that gave birth to a nation. Mount Vernon was not simply a grand mansion by the river. It was a living estate where the rhythms of daily life revealed the complexity of George Washington's world. At sunrise, the ground stirred with activity as enslaved men, women, and children began their labor, tending fields of wheat, corn, and tobacco, working in the kitchens, blacksmith shops, and stables, while overseers directed them under Washington's careful eye. The estate was organized with precision, reflecting Washington's desire for order. But behind this order lay the stark truth that much of the work was carried out by those denied freedom. It was here that farming was not only a livelihood, but also an experiment. Washington tested crop rotation, soil enrichment, and new methods, hoping to make Mount Vernon a model of progress. Yet this progress rested on the forced labor of more than 300 enslaved people who had no claim to the fruits of their work. By day, the fields echoed with the sounds of plow and hammers, while within the mansion, conversations turned to politics, treaties, and the fragile future of a republic struggling to define itself. Guests from across the Atlantic visited Mount Vernon, entering its grand dining room where Washington hosted lavish dinners, sometimes with dozens of chairs filled by diplomats, soldiers, and curious travelers. These gatherings sparkled with ideas of liberty, governance, and the promise of a new world. Yet just beyond the walls, enslaved servants poured wine, carried platters, and cleaned after the guests, listening to ideals that did not extend to them. This contrast makes Mount Vernon a place of deep contradictions. Washington was a champion of liberty, celebrated as a man who refused to become a king, yet within his estate, bondage remained the silent foundation of prosperity. He struggled with this conflict, sometimes expressing discomfort with slavery, even putting certain measures in place to free those enslaved at his will. But during his lifetime, Mount Vernon remained a plantation sustained by human bondage. This complexity is essential to understanding his legacy. On one hand, Mount Vernon represented the Enlightenment ideals of progress, reason, and order. Its architecture, gardens, and carefully planned landscapes told the story of refinement and vision. On the other hand, it revealed the painful truth that even the leader of a revolution for freedom could not fully separate himself from the economic system of slavery. Daily rhythms brought this tension into sharp focus. Mornings might find Washington riding across his property, inspecting fences, livestock, and fields, offering instructions to overseers, and checking the ledgers that recorded yields and profits. By afternoon, he might be in correspondence with statesmen, generals, or land agents, writing letters that would influence national policy. And in the evening, the mansion's candlelit halls might fill with laughter, music, and debate as influential guests discussed the meaning of liberty. Meanwhile, enslaved workers toiled unseen to maintain this life of refinement, their labor making possible the grandeur that visitors admired. The estate therefore became a reflection of the contradictions that marked the birth of the United States itself, a nation founded on ideals of freedom and equality, but built, in part, on the exploitation of enslaved people. Washington's own struggle mirrored this tension. He valued independence deeply, yet relied on a system that denied it to others. His choice to free those enslaved in his will after his death shows an awareness of this contradiction, but also reveals how far short even great leaders can follow their own principles in their own lifetimes. Mount Vernon embodies this legacy. For visitors today, walking through its rooms and fields means walking through both triumph and tragedy, through the story of a man who helped build a republic, but also remained bound to the old order of slavery. This state is at once inspiring and sobering. Its beauty and grandeur cannot be separated from the harsh truth that hundreds lived and died in its service without tasting the liberty that Washington fought for. And yet, this honesty gives Mount Vernon its power. It forces us to see history not as a simple tale of heroes, but as a layered narrative of choices, contradictions, and consequences. The daily life of Mount Vernon was not only about farming or politics. It was about the clash of ideals and realities. The fields and orchards carried the promise of innovation, while the slave quarters carried the weight of injustice. The dining room sparkled with talk of freedom, while the kitchen smoked with endless labor. The mansion itself became a stage where the contradictions of a nation were acted out each day. Washington's legacy, therefore, cannot be told without Mount Vernon, because here we see not only the achievements of a leader, but also the shadows that shaped his world. To stand within its grounds today is to feel the echoes of that complexity, The pride of a man who refused absolute power, the vision of a farmer who sought improvement, the grace of a host who welcomed leaders and thinkers, and the silence of those whose names were never recorded, but whose labor built the very foundation of this story. Mount Vernon, with all its beauty and contradiction, holds the truth of America's beginning. Liberty and bondage, ideals and compromises, greatness and limits, woven together in the life of man whose estate became both a sanctuary and a reminder that history is never simple. George Washington spent his last days at Mount Vernon, the estate that had been both his sanctuary and his stage for so much of his life. In December of 1799, after riding through his lands in bitter winter weather, he fell ill. Within days, despite the best efforts of physicians, Washington's condition worsened. His final hours were marked by dignity, calmness, and an acceptance that seemed fitting for a man who led a nation through revolution and then chosen to return to private life. When he passed on December 14th, the loss was felt across the young republic as though the very heart of the country had stopped beating. Mount Vernon, once a private home filled with the daily rhythms of farming and gatherings, suddenly became a sacred place. His burial on this estate, overlooking the Potomac River, transformed the land into something greater than itself. The tomb where his body rested drew mourners, admirers, and travelers from across the world, all wanting to pay respects to the man called the father of his country. Yet for many years after Washington's death, Mount Vernon slowly fell into decline. The mansion and the grounds showed signs of wear, and the nation's attention was often pulled to politics, expansion, and conflict. By the mid-19th century, the estate was in danger of being lost in neglect. It was then that a remarkable effort began, not by politicians or soldiers, but by ordinary women who believed Washington's home was too important to disappear. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association, founded in 1853, became the first National Historic Preservation Organization in the United States. They raised money through tireless campaigns, convincing Americans everywhere that saving Mount Vernon was not just about restoring a building, but about preserving the memory of the nation's beginning. With determination, they purchased the estate in 1858 and began the careful work of restoring it. Their timing was extraordinary, for only a few years later, the Civil War broke out. As armies clashed and the country nearly tore itself apart, Mount Vernon remained untouched, respected by both Union and Confederate soldiers as neutral ground, a symbol too sacred to defile. Visitors continued to come, even during those turbulent years, walking the halls where Washington had once stood and reflecting on what the nation was meant to be. Over the decades, the Ladies' Association maintained their stewardship, ensuring the mansion and grounds were preserved against decay and time. Their work allowed Mount Vernon to remain not just a relic, but a living reminder of the country's origins. Today, when travelers from every corner of the world step onto the estate, they walk into a place that is both a home and a shrine. The rooms are arranged as they were in Washington's day. The gardens bloom with the same care he once envisioned, and the Potomac still flows quietly in the distance, a river that has seen centuries pass, but still carries the same reflections it did in Washington's lifetime. To stand before his tomb is to stand before more than stone. It is to feel the weight of history, the gratitude of a nation, and a reminder that ideals can outlast the men who carried them. Mount Vernon is more than a tourist site. It is a symbol that links past to present. It shows how fragile memory can be, and how much effort is needed to protect it. It also shows how one place can hold the contradictions, triumphs, and struggles of an entire nation. Washington's estate tells us about the man who chose duty over power, about the land that shaped him, and about the vision that still guides the American story. Each visitor who walks its halls or gazes at its view becomes part of that story, carrying it forward into new generations. The estate has endured wars, neglect, and the passage of centuries, yet it stands because people believed it should. Its preservation is itself a lesson that history must be guarded, cherished, and retold if it is to live. And so Mount Vernon remains not frozen in the past, but alive as a symbol of beginnings, endings, and the continuity of a nation that still measures itself against the ideals born in its halls. In the quiet of its gardens, in the solemn air of its tomb, and in the grandeur of its mansion, Mount Vernon whispers the same messages carried since Washington's death, that the story of America is inseparable from the life, choices, and contradictions of its first leader, and that some places are too meaningful ever to be forgotten. As the sun sets over Potomac and the mansion casts its long shadow across the grounds, Mount Vernon reminds us that history is never just about walls and monuments. It is about the choices made within them, the lives that shaped them, and the legacies they leave behind. George Washington's home is more than a relic of the past. It is a mirror of America's triumphs and contradictions, its dreams and struggles. To walk through Mount Vernon is to walk beside the nation's first leader, to feel both the weight of his vision and the limits of his time. And even now, more than 2 centuries later, the estate whispers a timeless truth, that freedom, memory, and responsibility are fragile treasures, waiting to be carried forward by each new generation. We hope you enjoyed this story from the History Vault. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss the next chapter of history.